When I first bought the sprawling mountain estate perched high above the pines and looking down over the valley like a watchful sentinel, I never imagined that the peaceful retreat I had always dreamed of would turn into the battleground for one of the most absurd and outrageous conflicts of my life. A conflict that began with a smugly worded letter from the local homeowners association and escalated into something that would shake the very foundations of their little fiefdom. You see, I had worked tirelessly for decades to build my career, clawing my way up from a modest background, and after years of late nights, unrelenting effort, and sacrifices that most people couldn't even fathom, I had finally carved out the kind of success that allowed me to indulge in what I had always considered my reward. A mansion nestled into the side of a mountain with walls of glass that opened to endless horizons, a winding drive that cut through thickets of pine, and terraces where the air itself seemed purer, freer, and filled with the kind of quiet that the rest of the world has forgotten. And it was there, standing in the great room on the day I first moved in, gazing across the panoramic view, that I promised myself this would be a sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of politics, the demands of leadership, and the never-ending battles that come with being the governor of the state, though I never said that out loud to my neighbors, because anonymity was half the appeal of buying property so remote. And while I had expected some level of pushback from the HOA, given that power often attracts pettiness, I was not prepared for the lengths they would go to in trying to assert their so-called authority over me, beginning with an officious packet of paperwork shoved into my mailbox the very first week, filled with rules about lawn maintenance, fence color, acceptable roofing materials, and even the height of flagpoles, as if any of that applied to a mansion situated on 40 acres of private, gated land that wasn't even technically under their jurisdiction, yet somehow, through either incompetence or sheer arrogance, they had drawn their lines wide enough to claim my property as part of their community, and within days of ignoring their nonsense, I was bombarded with notices citing me for violations as ridiculous as failure to maintain uniform mailbox design, despite the fact that my mailbox was a mile from the nearest paved road and certainly not aligned with anyone else's, and excessive tree growth, as though the untouched forest surrounding my home was supposed to be trimmed into topiary animals for the pleasure of a committee that probably couldn't tell a pine from a spruce. And while I laughed at first, thinking it was all just a clerical error that could be resolved with a phone call, I quickly realized these people weren't making mistakes. They were making power plays, and nothing fuels a small-time tyrant like the illusion of control. So they began issuing fines, $50 here, $100 there, piling up until they claimed I owed them thousands, and each time I tossed their letters aside, they became bolder, threatening liens, court action, and eventually foreclosure, which I found particularly amusing given that the property was bought outright, the deed clear, and any competent attorney could dismantle their claims in minutes. But what made it infuriating rather than just laughable was their persistence, the smug persistence of people who believed they could bully anyone into submission, even me. And while I had no intention of revealing my position as governor at that stage, because there's a certain power in letting people underestimate you, I also wasn't about to let them ruin the refuge I'd built. So when one chilly morning in early autumn I found heavy machinery crawling up the drive, a convoy of trucks rumbling like invaders toward my home, I stood frozen at first in disbelief, because who in their right mind would authorize bulldozers to approach a private residence without a court order? But there they were, bright yellow machines flanked by men in reflective vests and hard hats, and leading the procession like some medieval baroness riding out to assert her claim was the HOA president herself, a woman named Marjorie Pickens, who had the pinched face of someone who had never smiled without calculating the political advantage of it, and she strutted up my drive with a rolled-up stack of papers under her arm, shouting over the growl of the engines that I had failed to comply with repeated demands, that my fines had accumulated to an unreasonable debt, and that the HOA board had voted unanimously to enforce structural compliance by removing my property altogether, which at first I thought had to be some kind of elaborate prank, because the absurdity of it was staggering, but the seriousness in her tone, the self-righteous gleam in her eyes, and the unmistakable movement of the machines behind her as their operators began revving for action made it clear this wasn't a bluff, it was a full-scale act of madness. And as I tried to reason with her, tried to remind her that this wasn't how the law worked, that private associations didn't have the authority to demolish someone's home, she waved her papers in my face and declared they had every right, under their charter, a charter that, in her words, superseded local and state governance, which was when I nearly laughed outright, because here was a woman telling the governor of the state to his face that her neighborhood committee had higher authority than the very government I represented, and though I still hadn't disclosed who I was, something in me snapped at that moment. Not anger exactly, but a cold resolve, the kind I'd honed during campaigns when opponents tried to smear me, the kind I'd felt in budget negotiations when bureaucrats tried to stonewall progress, and I told her plainly that, if one brick of my home was touched, she and her entire board would regret it in ways they couldn't begin to fathom. But she only sneered, gave a sharp signal to the foreman, and with a roaring lurch, the bulldozers advanced toward the outer retaining wall of my estate, their blades gleaming in the morning sun as if hungry for destruction. And that was the moment when the weight of the situation hit me fully, not the loss of the house itself, though the thought of my sanctuary crumbling was a bitter pill, but the realization that this HOA, this group of small-minded zealots drunk on their own fabricated authority, was willing to escalate to open destruction without legal standing, without hesitation, and without fear of consequence, and I knew then that once this battle began, it would not end quietly, because they had not just picked a fight with a homeowner, they had picked a fight with their governor, and by the time I finished dealing with them, the word HOA would carry a very different meaning across the state. As the first crunch of steel against stone echoed through the mountainside, sending vibrations up the walls of my mansion and rattling the glass panes like the trembling heartbeat of an enormous beast awakening, I realized that Marjorie Pickens and her band of overzealous committee members had crossed a line for which there could be no return, because while lawsuits, fines, and threats could always be negotiated or dismantled in the slow grind of bureaucracy, the deliberate physical destruction of private property was an act of aggression that demanded immediate response, and though I had chosen this home as a retreat, far from the noise of politics and the constant tug of duty, I carried with me always the instincts of a strategist, the ability to pivot from defense to offense in seconds. So instead of panicking, instead of throwing myself in front of the bulldozers like some desperate protester, I stepped back into the house, closed the heavy oak doors behind me, and placed a single phone call, not to the police because this was beyond their purview and because, ironically, they often deferred to HOA complaints under the misguided belief that these boards held legitimate authority, but to my chief of staff, a man named Victor who had weathered more storms with me than I could count, and the moment he answered, I didn't even need to explain the situation in detail, just the words, "The HOA is demolishing my house," were enough to set him into motion. His calm voice on the other end promising that within the hour the Attorney General's office, the Department of Public Safety, and every relevant legal authority would be mobilized. Yet even as I listened to him assure me that the machinery of government would grind these people into dust, I felt a stubborn fire rising in me, a refusal to simply let others handle the situation, because what was happening in real time wasn't just a matter for courts and legal briefs, it was a spectacle of arrogance, and if I didn't stop it immediately, my home would be rubble before the first injunction could be filed. So I pocketed my phone, strode to the garage, where my black SUV sat gleaming like a coiled predator, and pulled from the back the emergency kit I always kept with me, not just flares and a first aid kit, but a binder. Yes, a binder that contains signed orders, proclamations, and standing authorizations that I carried for worst-case scenarios, a relic of my meticulous nature, and among them were emergency powers clauses that could be invoked in defense of public safety and unlawful seizure, clauses I had hoped never to use but which seemed suddenly written for this very moment. And as I returned to the front drive, binder in hand, I found Marjorie standing triumphantly with her arms folded, the machines now inching closer to the mansion itself, one blade already scraping at the base of the retaining wall, and I raised my voice above the mechanical roar, announcing in a tone that carried the full weight of command that their actions were in direct violation of state law, that as governor I was ordering an immediate halt to all activity under penalty of criminal prosecution, and when the word governor hit the air, You could feel the silence ripple through the crowd of hired workers, their engines still rumbling, but their eyes wide, shifting nervously toward Marjorie as if to say, "Is he serious?" Because suddenly, this wasn't just some wealthy homeowner throwing a tantrum. This was the man whose signature appeared on their paychecks, the man who controlled the very agencies that could strip their licenses and bankrupt their companies. And though Marjorie tried to laugh it off, tried to insist I was bluffing, the men in hard hats began hesitating, throttling down their machines, glancing between her and me as though the air itself had shifted allegiances, and that's when I stepped forward, flipping open the binder and holding high an official proclamation that declared, in no uncertain terms, that any attempt to demolish or damage this property would be treated as an act of unlawful seizure and destruction of state-protected assets, not because my home was technically government property, but because, under emergency powers, I had the authority to classify any personal residence of the governor as protected, a safeguard written decades ago during more dangerous times, but still valid. And with that single declaration, the tide turned the bulldozer. Operators one by one cutting their engines, the silence returning to the mountain like a relieved exhale until only Marjorie's shrill voice cut through, accusing them of cowardice, insisting that my claims were smoke and mirrors, and then, in her desperation, she made the fatal mistake of lunging forward and tearing the proclamation from my hand, waving it above her head as though to expose it as a forgery, but all she succeeded in doing was allowing the gold-embossed seal to glint in the sun, the undeniable mark of state authority staring every onlooker in the face, and in that instant her credibility evaporated, her command broken, the workers stepping back from her like soldiers abandoning a sinking general. Yet what struck me most wasn't the collapse of her authority, but the fury burning in her eyes. Because instead of retreating, instead of realizing she had overplayed her hand, she doubled down, shrieking that this wasn't over, that the HOA would not be intimidated, that they had the right to govern their community free from government interference, a statement so ludicrous it bordered on treasonous, and before I could respond, she stormed off toward her car, slamming the door with such force that the echo bounced off the mountains, and with her departure, the machinery of destruction ground to a halt, the hired workers dispersing like sheep freed from a faulty shepherd. But the damage was already done. My retaining wall scarred, my windows cracked, and the sanctity of my sanctuary shattered. And as I stood there in the settling dust, binder still in hand, I knew this was only the opening salvo, because people like Marjorie didn't retreat forever, they regrouped, rearmed with lawyers and allies, and came back twice as vicious. And if she was willing to go this far in her first strike, I could only imagine the chaos she would unleash next, so I returned inside, sat at the great oak desk in my study, and began drafting a response, not just as a homeowner defending his property, but as the governor declaring war on the unchecked arrogance of HOA tyranny, outlining a plan to not only dismantle their authority over me, but to expose the entire system for what it had become, a shadow government run by unelected zealots who preyed on fear, fines, and intimidation. And as the hours passed, as the sun dipped below the ridgeline and the valley filled with the soft blues of twilight, I found myself almost grateful for Marjorie's madness because she had handed me on a silver platter the perfect case study for reform, the perfect narrative to rally both legislators and citizens, and by the time Victor arrived in person with a team of aides, armed with legal drafts and press strategies, I was already several steps ahead, laying out not just a counterattack, but a full-scale campaign. Because if they wanted a war, then a war they would get, and by the time I was done, no HOA in this state would ever again believe itself above the law, let alone above the governor. The days that followed were a blur of press flashes, late-night strategy sessions, and a new kind of exhaustion I hadn't felt since the campaign trail, because what began as a peculiar property dispute had metastasized into something far larger, an ideological fight over who gets to wield power in the everyday lives of citizens, and the moment I stepped out on the steps of my mountain house to hold my first press conference the next morning, flanked by Victor and 3 state attorneys, I could feel the weight of expectations settle on my shoulders like a new cloak. Cameras swiveled, microphones leaned forward like flowers thirsty for outrage, and phones buzzed in every pocket around me as reporters waited for the governor to say the thing that would either calm the tempest or set it ablaze. So I spoke plainly, without the clipped evasions of political speech, and told the cameras that what had happened at my property was not a private quarrel, but a test case of the creeping, unaccountable authority that some homeowners associations had come to believe they possessed, that an HOA was meant to be a neighborly association of volunteers enforcing reasonable community standards, not a private army with the capacity to seize and demolish. And then I announced a special task force comprised of the Attorney General, the Department of Consumer Protection, and independent legal scholars to investigate abuses of HOA power across the state, and that we would be fast tracking legislation to put meaningful checks and balances in place, including mandatory transparency of HOA charters, limitations on punitive fines, and an expedited appeals process for homeowners. The reaction was immediate and bifurcated. Local talk shows framed me as a defender of a little guy, a governor who would not tolerate bullying, while conservative radio hosts accused me of overreach, of weaponizing the state against citizens' voluntary associations, and social media erupted in a torrent of memes, think pieces, and furious op-eds. But amid the cacophony, a surprising current of sympathy for my plight swelled. Neighbors from nearby communities, people who had privately complained for years about petty fines and opaque boards, began sending emails and photographs of their own notice letters and levy statements, and suddenly our legal team's inbox filled with potential plaintiffs, evidence, and stories of families driven into foreclosure by escalating HOA penalties, turning my singular case into the tip of a hidden iceberg. Marjorie, of course, did not go quietly into the night. She hired a small army of counsel, a motley crew of lawyers whose billing rates suggested confidence or desperation, and launched a counterattack on two fronts. Legally, she filed suit, claiming our proclamation was an unlawful exercise of executive privilege and that the state had no right to interfere with her board's sovereign governance. And politically, she cultivated allies among a handful of influential county supervisors and local media figures by painting herself as an embattled citizen resisting a power-hungry governor, which, to her credit, was a narrative that played with simple emotions, David versus Goliath, except she cast herself as David and me as the Goliath, a sleight of hand that some voters accepted at face value. And in a move that surprised even my closest advisors, she organized a rally at the foot of my drive, complete with homemade signs, local, volunteers, and a chorus of chants about community autonomy, a spectacle designed to provoke and to force me into a public misstep. I could have ignored the provocation, of course, and let our legal team do its work in court, but politics is theater as much as policy, and the image of my home under threat with people marching at my gate was a tableau that could not be left unaddressed. So I chose to appear calm, measured, and unequivocal, walking out onto the gravel shoulder in a light. Jacket, hands uncuffed and empty to show I bore no weapons, and I listened to Marjorie's supporters shout and to the handful of counter-protesters who had come to stand with me, and when it was my turn to speak, I addressed not Marjorie, but the camera, the crowd, and the state. I told them that voluntary associations must never be permitted to wield coercive power with impunity, that neighbors must be free to live without the fear of capricious fines, and that the bulwark of democracy was the written law, not private vendettas. And while some in the crowd booed and others applauded, a thoughtful hush fell over sections of the gathering as people tried to reconcile the image of a man who had the trappings of wealth with the very real stories of abuse we were now unearthing. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, our legal team moved like a well-oiled machine, injunctions were drafted, motions filed, and a judge in the county seat granted a temporary restraining order that halted any further demolition and frozen HOA enforcement actions against my property pending a full hearing, but the judge's order was narrower than I'd hoped. It applied only to the present action, not to systemic reforms, which meant the broader fight would have to be waged in the legislature and in the court of public opinion, and so we pivoted to a two-track strategy, pursue justice for the immediate wrong, and use my case as leverage to secure statutory reforms that would protect homeowners statewide. That strategy demanded political capital, and spending political capital requires concessions. Friendships were called in, compromises brokered, and the first draft of the HOA reform bill surrendered some of our more ambitious goals to gain bipartisan traction, for example, scaling back the scope of mandatory audits in favor of greater reporting requirements. But even those concessions were met with fierce lobbying from well-funded HOA lobbying groups who framed our proposals as an assault on property rights, and their messaging hit home with a subset of legislators who feared that curbing HOA power might open a Pandora's box of government interference. As all this unfolded, the media circus intensified. Late-night comedians sketched the scene of a governor arguing with a woman about mailbox designs, opinion editors penned columns praising my stance or warning of slippery slopes, and investigative series ran exposes on rogue boards who had weaponized their charters to extract riches. From neighbors and the human side of the story, the families who'd lost homes to lien foreclosures instigated by tiny committees began to surface in heartbreaking profiles that gave the issue real teeth. But power struggles have a nasty way of becoming personal, and Marjorie, sensing the tilt of public sympathy away from her, escalated not with policy debate, but with dirt, smears, and petty sabotage. Anonymous flyers accused me of using state resources to enrich myself, a fake social media account posted a doctored photo suggesting I had personally ordered the demolition, and someone tampered with the gate code to my property one night, a violation we reported and traced back to a reseller of security services with ties to a PAC associated with a local HOA lobbying group, which only confirmed to me that this was no longer merely an argument over bylaws, but a war of attrition aimed at humiliating and exhausting me personally. In quieter moments, late at night, I sat at my kitchen table with my wife, who had been a steady and fierce presence through every chapter of my life, and we spoke candidly about the toll this was taking on our family, on our children, on the very idea of private life in public office. And while she urged restraint, she also reminded me of why I had fought to serve in the first place, to protect the vulnerable when the powerful box them in, which is exactly what these HOA practices did, hiding predatory tactics behind the veneer of community standards. Emboldened by that reminder and mindful of the fragile coalitions we were building in the legislature, I prepared to take the fight to the hearing, to marshal witnesses, to bring before the judge not only the facts of our case, the illegal demolition attempt, the forged or misapplied covenants, the intimidation of workers, but the broader evidence of systemic abuse. And as I readied these files on a rainy afternoon, watching the droplets bead and streak down the great windows of my study like the tears of a world I had thought secure, I realized that victory, if it came, wouldn't be a single triumphant decree, but a slow, grinding remaking of norms, an education of citizens about the limits of private governance, and the cultivation of laws that balanced autonomy with accountability. And with that sense of long fight hardening into resolve, I closed the folder, kissed my wife's hand, and walked out to face the next round, knowing that the story we were writing would end either in a chastened HOA system bound by clearer rules or in a precedent that allowed small tyrannies to grow unchecked. And that knowledge was both terrifying and clarifying because it meant everything and nothing at once. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and heavy with clouds, as though the sky itself anticipated the clash about to unfold within the county courthouse. And when I arrived, escorted by Victor, my attorneys, and a modest security detail, the steps were already swarming with cameras, protesters, and supporters, their chants colliding in a cacophony that turned the courthouse lawn into a battlefield of signs and slogans, one side proclaiming "Stop HOA Tyranny" and the other side waving placards that read "Protect Community Rights." And though I kept my expression neutral, I felt the full weight of symbolism bearing down on me, because what was about to happen in that courtroom was more than a dispute about fines or a damaged wall. It was the crucible in which the future boundaries of private governance and public law would be tested. And so when the gavel struck and the judge, a stern woman with years of federal clerkship under her belt, called the room to order, I sat at the plaintiff's table with my team, binder open before me like a shield, and listened as Marjorie Pickens swept into the courtroom with her entourage of lawyers, her pinched face carefully arranged into an expression of injured dignity, as though she were the one being dragged unjustly into the light. And her lead counsel began with a sweeping assertion that the HOA charter, voted on and ratified by the community, carried the force of contract law, and superseded what they termed politically motivated overreach by the governor's office, a claim so brazen that even the court stenographer raised an eyebrow before clattering it down in her machine. And when it was our turn to respond, my attorney laid out the unassailable facts that my property was never properly incorporated into the HOA's jurisdiction, that the fines were baseless, that the attempted demolition was undertaken without any lawful court order, and that the very act of mobilizing heavy machinery without the consent of the property owner or a sheriff's writ constituted criminal trespass and destruction of property. But beyond the legal points, he emphasized the broader danger that allowing private associations to interpret their charters as superseding state authority set a precedent that would unravel the rule of law itself. And while Marjorie's counsel sneered, insisting this was hyperbole, the judge's narrowing eyes suggested she understood the gravity. Over the course of 3 days, the hearing stretched, with witness testimony ranging from bulldozer operators admitting they were misled about permits to neighbors testifying about years of petty harassment and escalating fines for absurd infractions like mismatched flower pots. And through it all, Marjorie sat rigid, lips pressed into a thin line, occasionally scribbling notes to her counsel, but unable to disguise the mounting realization that the fortress she thought impregnable was crumbling under the weight of evidence and public scrutiny. By the third afternoon, when I took the stand myself, the courtroom was electric with anticipation, cameras buzzing in the back despite strict limitations, and I spoke not as a politician, but as a homeowner and a citizen, telling the court how I had sought peace in the mountains, how I had ignored the first notices out of disbelief, how I had watched in shock as machines rolled up my drive, and how I had stood there holding a proclamation, not as a weapon, but as a plea for sanity in the face of madness. And I ended my testimony by saying that this was not just about my house, but about every person who had ever felt powerless before a board that claimed authority it did not truly have. When I stepped down, there was a hush in the courtroom, the kind of silence that lingers when something resonates deeper than expected. And though Marjorie's lawyers tried to tear at my credibility by suggesting I had used my office to intimidate their client, the counterargument fell flat. Because the facts spoke louder than any insinuation, and by the time closing arguments were made, it was clear to most observers which way the scales were tipping. Still, when the judge announced that she would issue a written ruling within a week, the suspense was almost unbearable, though in the meantime the legislature, emboldened by the visibility of the case, moved rapidly, and within days we had assembled a bipartisan coalition to pass the first round of HOA reforms, modest in scope, but groundbreaking in precedent. Mandatory transparency in budgets, caps on cumulative fines, and state oversight of foreclosure actions. And while lobbyists howled and warned of the death of community autonomy, the public response was overwhelmingly supportive, with letters pouring into my office thanking us for standing up, and families sharing stories of debts forgiven or abusive boards being challenged. Yet, even as victories accumulated, Marjorie refused to concede. She held fiery press conferences outside her cul-de-sac headquarters. She accused the state of orchestrating a witch hunt, and at one point she even filed a federal complaint alleging violation of civil liberties, though it was swiftly dismissed as frivolous. But her stubbornness only underscored the lesson I had been learning all along. That power, once tasted, is rarely surrendered willingly, and that reform requires not just laws but vigilance. When the judge's ruling finally arrived, crisp and devastating in its clarity, it declared that the HOA had acted well outside its jurisdiction, that the attempted demolition was unlawful, that the fines levied were null and void, and that damages were owed to me not only for the property harm but for emotional distress, a sum so significant that it effectively bankrupted the association. And though I might have celebrated, I felt instead a quiet sense of justice, because it was never about money, it was about drawing a line in the sand, about proving that even the governor was not above the law, but neither was he beneath it, and that no cabal of neighbors, however organized, could trample fundamental rights. The media hailed it as a landmark case, headlines declaring Governor topples rogue HOA, and talk shows debating whether this would trigger a nationwide wave of reform. And indeed, I began receiving calls from legislators in other states eager to replicate our model, to to curb the excesses of associations that had grown bloated with unchecked authority. And in the months that followed, as the reforms took root and families reported breathing easier in their own neighborhoods, I found myself standing once again on the terrace of my mountain mansion, the scars of the bulldozer's blade now repaired, the stone gleaming stronger than before, and I thought about the strange irony that what I had sought as a place of escape had become the front line of a battle that changed the landscape of governance itself, yet perhaps that was always the destiny of those in public service, that even in moments of retreat, the fight finds you, demanding that you act, and though the road had been long, bruising, and filled with bitterness, it had ended with something worth the struggle. A reaffirmation that the law belongs to the people, not to petty tyrants hiding behind charters. And as I looked out across the valley, the wind carrying the scent of pine and freedom, I smiled not because I had won, but because we all had,